Last night, before we get into some hoops, we saw the first iteration of the Curt Cignetti era with the spring game, and of course, it was just as Cignetti put it, a glorified practice. But it was very good to see the pieces out there, and I said earlier that it was obvious there is a difference in the product on the field. You could see speed on both sides of the ball, but especially offensively, the running back room looks really good. The offensive line looks upgraded. The quarterbacks look like they are competitive. David Jackson looked really good. And it was just, there's a lot of positives. Not that it was perfect. And I've told people, don't get excited thinking I'm saying Indiana's going to run out and win a Big Ten title. But this is not the same old Indiana, and that they're going to be competing in games that they weren't competing in, and quite possibly winning games that they weren't finishing and winning.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, listen, it's, spring games are what they are. Even there was a moment where we were asking Curt Cignetti about some of the second team offense plays last night. And, he said that was trying to figure out if the second team offense was so good. The first, the second defense was was not. And he even kind of said, I think I know the answer to that question. It was,
and I think that we both know the answer to it too.
It was reminiscent of that scene in We Are Marshall where he says, something like the offensive line is really struggling to block, and I don't think it's because the defensive line is just that good. But I agree with, particularly offensively. Number one, I thought you could see why Cignetti has, maybe with some reservation, been cautiously optimistic about offensive line play through the preseason. That unit just looked steady, wasn't fully healthy, a couple pieces, missing, a couple guys just out with surgeries and things, be fine for the season. But, you saw veteran presence. I thought you saw, some good things from the first string line and the second string line. Excuse me. And then that leads you to, a good offensive line play allows you to showcase an offensive backfield that suddenly looks a little bit better. And we saw some moments when guys really popped, and some explosive runs. But I thought, and Cignetti mentioned this post-game or post-spring game, however you put it, there were a number of times where I just saw Indiana's backs moving forward. And it's, just like whereas last year when Indiana run the ball on first down, it would get a yard or two. Now it was getting 3 or 4. And that may not sound like a big gap, but, 2 yards on first down and 2 yards on second down sets up 3rd and 6. 4 yards on first down and 3 yards on second down sets up 3rd and 3. It's literally half the challenge. So, just a lot of kind of the offense being able to stay on schedule, the offense being able to move the ball, some stops. The defense had some moments. I also thought there were a couple moments, frankly, when Cignetti might have kind of put his thumb on the scale because he wanted, certain scenarios in terms, like there was one time where he went to the official and I think I was pretty clearly told him to call grounding on Curtis Rourke when it wasn't grounding, because he wanted to set up some scenarios, to get a look at certain things. Some really good moments from receivers. Anderson Kobe had, probably the catch of the night. Donovan McCulley had a touchdown catch. I thought you saw Elijah Sarrett, 2 or 3 moments that kind of pop off the page, what made him so good at JMU and make him such an intriguing player for Indiana. And then also just depth. We're sitting here and talking about those 3 guys, and yet Miles Cross had a couple nice moments. Miles Price had a couple nice moments. Omar Cooper had a couple nice moments. Saw more tight end and less 4 wide than I expected, but you also never know what coaches are maybe comfortable or not comfortable putting on tape when they're having these, publicized spring games. This was on the Big Ten Network. Anybody can get a hold of it. So, encouraging moments. You never want to make too much out of anything when it comes to spring football, but, if you're Indiana, I don't think you're coming out of last night. I don't think you're coming out of last night overly concerned, I guess, if that makes sense. You're coming out of last night probably more optimistic than concerned, while still knowing that there's some stuff you're going to have to deal with, some stuff you're going to have to address.
Yeah, in the wrap up last night, one of the things I said was there are guys on the roster right now that probably won't be on the roster in the fall. Not that they're getting booted or whatever, but the portal's still open. And there are guys that are not on the roster right now that will be when fall comes around. The kid from Arizona State, the quarterback, hit the portal yesterday, originally committed to Florida, and there's his NIL deal went south, but it is what it is. And I hate saying this sucks or that sucks now, but because it just is what it is. But it really, you hate to see guys that are playing with a team in the spring and then turning around and leaving them before you get going. It's just it's still an odd situation, and I don't think it ever will not be an odd situation.
Well, and obviously this portal cycle is different because they haven't closed and they may not close, but they haven't closed this loophole around. I don't say loophole; it's the rule. They have not found a way to address this sort of rule around multi-time transfers and the idea that you can move basically whenever you want, as long as you're in good academic standing. So you have to move between semesters. You have to be able to make a good faith case that your grades are in order and all that, but you aren't limited by how many times you can transfer within the confines of where you are in your academic career, in terms of that you get one transfer before you graduated and then the grad transfer option once you graduated. Now you can transfer whenever. So it's going to be even more sort of active that way. And that is a little weird, but the flip side is it's another way that all of this just kind of comes to further resemble, the idea of free agency in professional sports. Think of the layers of, I think about baseball, for example, where, the winter is when everything's supposed to happen, right? Like the winter meetings and, everything kind of from like Thanksgiving through, maybe mid-February, and then spring training hits. But then there's like a second round of free agency, essentially, once you get really deep into it, once you start getting to spring training. The guys that need to find a home and haven't yet, they start to scramble a little bit, and there's another round of, and then there are roster cut downs at the end of spring training, and teams go searching to see if they can find veterans that they didn't expect to be on the free agent market. Then it is something that we actually have a sort of analogs to in professional sports. It's just, again, college sports looking a little bit more like professional sports.
Absolutely. And this is a big weekend. In addition to it being Little Five, Indiana has had already a couple of guys in for visits, and Connor Esigian, Elijah Malone, the NAIA transfer, and Kanan Carlisle this weekend begins his visit today, although they lost Amari Williams as that visit was canceled. And it's been widely thought that Carlisle was, I hate to call him a lock for Indiana, but that's been the perception. But even with what they have added, which has been a lot, and they've added some big pieces, no pun intended. Have they yet to address the true shooting woes that they have been experiencing?
Probably not yet. No. Carlisle is a player that I think you can make a pretty reasonable case will shoot better if he's, you look at what Stanford asked him to do last year. Like, Indiana would not put that much on his shoulders in terms of, usage rate, in terms of, not just shot volume, but like the extent to which he was being asked to create for others. I mean, he was, at times that team's de facto point guard, not that others weren't, kind of contributing as well, but he shot 32% from three last season. I wouldn't be stunned if you put him on a team with Trey Galloway and Miles Rice and Gabe Cupps and said, hey, you're going to just spot up a little bit more. You get to be off the ball a little bit more. I wouldn't be stunned if 32% goes to 35 or 36. You know what I mean? On a similar level of volume, because you're reducing what you're physically and I guess mentally asking of him possession by possession, and that allows him to focus a little bit more on certain areas of the game. Obviously, you mentioned Connor Esigian. I think if you're Indiana or anybody, frankly, recruiting Esigian, You probably are banking on the idea that last season was largely about the back injury and just not really being able to kind of find his way back into the rotation. Once he kind of fell out and couldn't quite get healthy, and you had AJ Storr and Max Klesmit and Chucky Hepburn, and there just suddenly wasn't, it was a little bit more crowded back there. But Essegian's a three-point shooter. He was in high school. He was his freshman year at Wisconsin. I don't think there's any reason to believe that he can't be that player again, whether that's as a starter or as a key reserve. I think if he's the sort of player that if he were coming off the bench for Indiana, we'd still be seeing him probably 18, 20 minutes a night. Like, I think he'd be a pretty regular player within that rotation. If they don't get him, if they don't get Carlisle, I've heard the same thing, that Carlisle may be leaning toward Indiana. We'll see what this weekend brings. I really haven't heard anybody else's name mentioned with Carlisle, but it's worth saying, like, sometimes that stuff can just be echo chambery, that you're all about kind of focusing on one school and their recruiting efforts and who's on their big board and who are they trying to get in for visits and stuff. And you kind of get tunnel vision and you don't hear as much about it. But if Carlisle does wind up committing after this visit or during this visit or whatever, that's a really big piece for Indiana next season. If you could add Connor Essegian to that, then I think what you'd see potentially is Indiana, and not necessarily say they're done, but more kind of the idea of, if Indiana were able to get both of those guys in, then Indiana would be able to say, hey, we've got 2 spots left. We've addressed the biggest needs here. Now it's sort of like, hey, let's slow down. Let's take a breath. Let's reassess what we still need, what's out there. And, your thinking becomes more refined. And you also know that it's potentially going to be, you're going to have to be a little bit more targeted about the guys you're recruiting, because, guys who are looking for big minutes aren't going to be as interested in you if they're saying, well, you just took 3 guards that go straight into your rotation and a big that's going to start. So, if I'm coming to you, I'm coming for a bench role at best. It's funny. Like, I thought about this yesterday when I was having this conversation with somebody. Like, Anthony Walker would be the perfect transfer for this Indiana team right now. And, he was good for Indiana last year, but he'd be perfect for Indiana right now. Veteran player, didn't necessarily expect to start, could give you quality. Could come in a little bit of a tweener, could give you a little bit more flexibility coming off the bench. Could the sort of player who could play 8 minutes one night and it not affect him when you needed him to play 22 minutes the next night, that kind of thing. So you're more looking for that player, but you can be a bit more patient, that there's not necessarily as much sort of urgency to go get that player, because that player is not necessarily at the top of a bunch of other schools' recruiting boards. The guys that are at the top of everybody else's wish list probably not going to consider Indiana if Indiana's already got, in this hypothetical, Rice, Carlisle, Essegian, Ballo, because they're going to say, well, in addition to Malik Renew, Bryson Tucker, Trey Galloway, Mackenzie Mbako, Gabe Cupps played a lot last year, and you got Shekai Newton and Anthony Leal. So where are my minutes in all this? So that's when maybe it becomes a little harder to find guys that fit exactly what you're looking for. But again, you can be more patient because you feel like you've addressed the biggest needs, and now you can be a little bit more selective. You can be a little bit more careful, essentially.